friends, it's Matt Tommy, and welcome to another edition of the Thriving Christian Artist Podcast. So glad that you're here. I am super excited to have a longtime friend of mine, Stephen Roach, here with me, who is honestly one of the most thoughtful and genuine, authentic, deep, creative people that I know. Stephen, super honored that you're here, man. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's always a pleasure when we get to connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know many people are going to know your name through all the incredible work that you're doing in the creative realm. But for those folks that maybe just getting to know you, why don't you give us the kind of the thumbnail sketch, and then we'll jump into our conversation today.
Yeah, sure thing. So I am a musician. I'm also a fellow podcast hoster for the Makers and Mystics podcast. I've done some creative community leading through the Breath and the Clay and just writer, poetry. Yeah, if you cut me, I bleed creativity. So that's kind of that's kind of my background.
I love it. I was so excited a couple of years ago to hear that word polymath, and I'm like, there's a word for us. Like, we're not crazy. This is a thing, right?
That's exactly right. We finally got diagnosed.
I know it. I know it. So, well, I've loved watching your journey and being a part of your journey a little bit, just as friends and colleagues and all that God's called us to do, and have always appreciated your ability to navigate all the things that you do creatively in such a beautiful way. Has that always kind of been your mode of operation, I guess, or is that something that you've kind of had to settle into as a creative?
Yeah, well, I jokingly tell people, but maybe not so jokingly, that I was condemned to be a musician from the start. And what I mean by that is, my mother was one of 15 kids
Hmm.
living out in a 2-room shack in the woods of North Carolina, tobacco farming family.
Wow.
And then my dad was a third-generation Appalachian fiddle player from up in Franklin, North Carolina. So I had music coming at me from both sides from the very beginning, and I was seeing banjos and fiddles and guitars and all these different expressions of music and creativity from the very beginning. And so I've always been an explorer and an experimentalist, trying out different instruments, whether it was,
Sure.
percussion, guitar, this or that. Let me just see what I can do. And that's translated into other areas as well. There have been times when I've worked in theater and, written some books. And so it's just, I don't know. I think the common denominator is just this curiosity that keeps me going and whatever seems to be inspiring me for the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things and I know you and I both are, although we may come at it from different ends of things, I know that there's always this tension that we're all in as creatives, is this idea that we want to push in authentically to what God's called us to creatively and go with the curiosity and go with the passion and that sort of thing. And yet there's also this thing of, I feel like God's called me to make a living in this and the monetization of that. And I know, I'm always trying to encourage the folks that I'm around, don't rob yourself of the creative passion and the creative journey just to monetize, because you get out, you may have something to monetize, but it may not be worth it anything. It's not bringing you joy and all that. So how have you balanced that? Because I know that you are, in the myriad of things that you do make a living from all of your creativity. You're encouraging others to do that. And yet you're insanely passionate about going with what's in your gut creatively as well, and being authentic to that.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lifelong learning lesson for me and how to
Right.
do that. And the language I've been putting on that lately is a hierarchy of values.
Mm.
And I've had to come at all the different creative things I do from that framework that, as a for instance, just talking about book writing alone, I have desires to write a memoir about my life. I also have desires to write poetry books. I also have desires to write another creative book like Naming the Animals. But I've had to come to the place where I'm like, okay, which pursuit makes most sense looking at my life as a whole? Which one of these creative endeavors will
Right.
also interact with the audience that keeps up with my work? Which one of these will keep that passion ignited in me,
Sure.
which one of these will bring a monetary return and which one is the most pertinent for this cultural moment. So I'm always
Right.
thinking about these different things that create a hierarchy of values in my life. And that's helped me a lot. And then, the other thing is I just keep one of these with me everywhere I go. And I'm constantly writing notes so that
Right.
when the muse shows up, I don't lose any of the inspiration that might come, and
Yeah.
hopefully I can return to it at a later time. But that's
Yeah.
that's kind of what's working for me at the moment.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just stewarding the inspiration that comes because, I I hate it when I hear people, talk about I've got creative block or I've got this or God's not speaking. I'm like, listen, God is always speaking. Are you catching the nuggets? And those little notebooks or your recorder or whatever it is, it gives us the ability to catch those things in the net of our heart, right? To be able to come back to. And I just
Yes.
I love that. So, you know, it's interesting as we're in this stage in our life. So I'm a little further along than you, but not too far. This kind of, we'll say, younger middle age.
I'm catching up faster than I want to be.
I know, but I'll be 50 this year, and so it's interesting as you kind of look back on your life and creativity and how it's come out. There have been these sort of waves or seasons where, like for me, when I came out of college, I was primarily a worship leader and musician and that sort of thing. Then I kind of got out of that and I evolved into doing graphic design and marketing. And then I evolved out of that. And for the last 13, 14 years, I've been doing my baskets primarily. And now God's kind of bringing me back into writing and speaking and doing my mentoring. And it's like, I think a lot of times we think, oh, well, did I get it wrong in the past? But it's not that. There are these seasons. There are these seasons of life when this part of creativity comes out and is primary for us, and the others are there, but they're not primary. And I just love for you to kind of, vamp on that a little bit, because I think people can get really frustrated with their creative journey if they don't realize that there are these seasons of ebb and flow where things come primary and then they become secondary.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the most important things that a creative can learn, because I know, at least in my own life, I held on so tightly to the way that I thought my dreams were supposed to come to
Mm,
pass, that
yeah, yeah,
when, as inevitably it does, life doesn't ever take the trajectory that we think it
right.
does. It's like we get these visions that are beautiful and they are meant to carry us through a season, but they don't always turn out the way that we think. And so, for instance, talking about the musical part of my life, I was setting up chairs in my family dining room at 8 years old and trying to sell tickets to my parents and family members to come watch me perform. You know, I played my first public performance at the age of 13. And so, all music and performing has always been a long-term thing in my life. But listen, let's be honest, even after a decade or more of touring professionally, even internationally
Yeah.
touring, 2 a.m. in a smelly van with 6 dramatic, hungry musicians, I think that stage of my journey might be over for the moment, right?
The thrill is gone, right?
you know, uh, but that was a really painful transition for me that I had to come to terms with. But I remember feeling so strongly just that little still small voice speaking to me and saying, Stephen, if I gave you success in the way that you've imagined it, it would be at the expense of so much more that I want
Yeah,
to do through your
yeah,
life. And so I think sometimes even our ideas of success or the visions we have in our mind for what a dream is supposed to look like or become, they're not always accurate. We see in part, we don't always see the full picture. And so for me, it's been a dance of learning how to hold on to the things that I am passionate about so that they don't get pummeled in the undertow of responsibilities and making a living and things like that. But at the same time, holding them loosely enough
right.
that when it's time to change, when it's time to move on, that I don't end up living a past version of myself that is no longer going to bear the fruit that this current version of myself is meant to bear,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's hard to learn, but we all have to go through that.
It is, because it doesn't make sense in our mind. Like, how could this fruitful thing not be the thing that I'm going to ride forever? And yet
Yes.
it can, that thing can be the very enemy of what God is trying to bring into
Yes.
our life. I remember, I've shared it on the podcast before, but I guess it was end of 2019. I had a dream, and I was standing at the back of my studio in Asheville, which you've been to, the big studio and all this. And in the dream, I was looking into the studio, and it was completely swept clean. And I was thanking the Lord for what a beautiful season that this had been. And
Wow.
I walked out the door, and I woke up rebuking the devil. I'm like, this cannot be God. This is, there's no way. But all the identity work, right? And all the work that you think you've done around who you are in Christ and what God's called you, it suddenly goes out the window, right? When that moment
Yes.
of you know real quickening and real challenge comes. And I think it's been so difficult, for me, just honestly, over the years, to be able to let go of the thing that has been successful. But that's always right. This divine exchange, right? Will you
Hmm.
let go of the thing that you've known, that has been successful, that even it's been the most fruitful in your life, in order to take hold of this next thing that you don't fully
Yes.
see yet. That's
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 right.
faith, isn't it?
Yes. It reminds me of something that a dear mutual friend of ours said to me, Ray Hughes. And, of course, Ray Hughes has been a friend and a mentor in my
Yeah.
life for decades at this point, but he and I were riding in a car late at night in the middle of Kentucky. I don't even know where we were, but it was right during this transition in my life from music to some of the other things that I'm doing now. And he said, Stephen, sometimes dreams are meant to carry us through a particular season until we're ready to embrace, the next thing that our lives are meant to do. And I just
Mm,
remember that was so strange to me at that time. I'd never heard anybody say that or even give me the permission to let go of one thing and embrace another thing. And so
yes.
that I think that permission is something that we all have to have. It's like, okay, this has been a part of my identity expression, but it's okay because I'm rooted in something deeper than the work of my hands.
Yeah, yeah, that's so good, because it's the work of our hands that we tend to want to worship, right? Which is,
That's right. Yes.
that's always the challenge. Are we gonna get our identity from who Jesus says we are, the things that we do?
Yeah. I think that is something that is vital. I know you've talked a lot about that on your podcast and in your books. It's just that identity part of us. And I've expressed it like this. I've said, our creative works are not the roots, but they are the branches. They're the branches, but
So
the
good.
roots, go into something else. And so
Yeah,
even if the branches go in different directions, they're probably going to draw from that same root system in our
yeah,
lives. And so anyway, yes, very much.
yeah. I just love that. I'm thinking about how, as I started growing in the kingdom and kind of understanding identity and all that sort of thing, and you're thinking about balancing, what it is that you do creatively. Um, I kind of started coming, and I try to walk like this. I'm interested in your thoughts. I I try to walk in this place where, if I'm doing something primary, it doesn't mean that, like, and it's like my income, it's the thing that people know me for or whatever. Even though that's a focus of what I'm doing, I try to give room in my life for the other things. And I'll just, even as an example, when I started closing down my basket business and that sort of thing, which I was like, that's what I was known for, for so many years. And I started painting. I'm painting right now on, just really as a spiritual process, kind of processing with the Lord. And part of that was processing grief from my mom's death and that sort of
Mm,
thing. But I felt like the Lord, never led me to, and still is not, to monetize that, to put it out there. But it's this really valuable thing that I do, that I give time to and space to. And I just am really coming to the understanding that, whether it's out front or whether it's behind, like, it's all the kingdom. It's all important. It's all a part of who I am. And it all has to be nurtured. And just because it may or may not be making money, or may or may not have a website or whatever, doesn't mean that it's any less important.
right, exactly. And I think there's a tendency to feel like if our art is not monetized, or if it's not our full-time living, or
Right.
if we're not super famous for what we do, we can tend to feel that it invalidates that work, or that it doesn't have the value or significance that maybe it would if we monetized it. And that leads me to think about the imposter syndrome,
Yeah,
you
sure.
know. But I forget where I heard this, but it's like, I forget who said it, but it was basically, you know, if you write, you're a writer.
Yeah, right.
If you paint, you're a painter. If you do music, you're a musician. Whatever it is, it's like the effect that it has in the world. Although I know that we all desire the things that we do to be fruitful, to give a good ROI, for what we're doing. I don't think monetizing it is always the signifier of its worth. And I know that there are certain things, like you were saying, like my poetry. I don't know that my poetry has ever brought in a significant amount of income for me. But if I don't write, it's going to affect my
Yeah,
own
definitely.
internal calibration, so to speak. It's like it serves a different purpose. And so for
Yeah,
me, I'm constantly writing, I'm constantly reading, and I think it has value for my life. But
yeah.
I've not yet monetized my poetry. Maybe I'll take your mentoring class and you can teach me how to, you know.
Well, I'm just thinking about, my own, like every day I play the piano still. I still go in there and
Mhm.
sing. I'm still writing. I don't pass by the piano if I don't, doodle around it a little bit, but that's a part of my own mental health, right? That's a part of my
Yes.
own self, cultivation. And I know
Right.
that's something you're really passionate about. I mean, I think you guys did a whole series on that
Mhm.
on Makers and Mystics, but just about this idea of mental health and the artists and that sort of thing. I mean, some things that we do creatively are just for us. They're just
That's right.
to keep us sane, keep us connected with the Lord, keep us connected with that inner heart place. I mean, talk about that, because I know that's something you're really passionate about as well.
Yeah, well, I think what you said is really key, that some things, maybe they're not for the public. Maybe
Right.
some of it is just for our own mental health. And I think sometimes distinguishing what is for the public and what is just for us could save a lot of hardship, and say and save us from spewing our pathologies on our audience, or
Right.
even looking to our audience to be our therapist or something like that. Um, but you're right. This topic of mental health and the artist has been something that has been so important in my life for personal reasons. It's also something that I see so important to so many in this generation, especially coming out of COVID, coming out of everything that we've gone through over the past several years. So we did a series on mental, emotional, spiritual health for the artist, and then we did a series on restoration for the heart of the
Mm,
artist. And all those things came out of my own personal experience.
right.
I've talked a lot about it in other places, but I went through some pretty intense personal crisis and just backed away from everything to get my faith right, to get my relationships right, to get my own heart right, and spent a significant time where none of the art that I was doing was for public consumption.
Mm.
I probably wrote over 20 songs on the piano, and I didn't even know I was a piano player. But uh but those songs carried me through that, and they
Yeah.
served to like really help my own process of restoration and healing and working through my own stuff. But it's funny that on the other side of that season, I'm seeing so many people just saying, "Thank you. We've been through something so similar," or "Our lives have just been crazy turned upside down since the pandemic,"
Yeah.
and learning how we can actually minister to that place. And that sometimes I call it now. I'm talking about Henry Nouwen coined the phrase "wounded healers."
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Great
he
book.
got from, yeah, that he got
Yeah.
from Carl Jung. But I see the artist in this season as having the ability to be these wounded healers for our culture.
Yeah.
And just, when we submit those difficult things that we go through, when we submit those to the Holy Spirit, to be able to then become wounded healers for other people going through that. And
Yeah.
that's something so close to my own creative journey.
No, I love that. I mean, it's this idea that we allow our creative expression to be this overflow of what God's doing, and it becomes this intersection point where people can, touch the heart of God and see
Yes,
Him in a completely different way and experience His presence in a different way. And it's
I
that
love it.
um, we did a podcast with I think my friend Aaron Brown, that's out
Oh
in
yeah, yeah.
California. Such a great guy, and but we did this whole thing on empathy and creative empathy. And
Mm.
he's got this really great, I'm trying to think of what it was, this word that he puts with empathy, but visual empathy. That's what he says. But just this idea that, his paintings become this opportunity where when people look at it, they're connecting with the heart of God, and they're seeing themselves in
Yes.
this. They're seeing his heart for them. And it is this visual empathy. And I'm like, wow, what, with audio, with dance, with visual, with reading and writing, whatever it is, that's what we're called to do, isn't it? To bring heaven
Yes.
to earth in that way.
That's right. That reminds me of a book. I'm looking at it on my shelf right here, but a friend of mine, Mary McCampbell,
Mm.
wrote a book called Imagining Our Neighbors as Ourselves.
I had her on the
And
podcast. Great,
oh,
great.
did you? Yeah,
Yeah, she's
yes. I was
awesome.
gonna say you should have her on if you haven't already. But
Yeah,
that empathy is what that reminded me of. And so
yeah, absolutely. Well, Stephen, I love what you're doing. I've always loved the authenticity and the joy that you bring. And I always tell people, I said, listen, if you want a deep guy full of creativity and a lot smarter than I am, go listen to
mm,
Stephen Roach, because he is
mm.
you. I just love all the things that you bring, and it's just always a joy to have you on and share. I know that
Mhm.
folks are going to want to connect with you. You've got conferences, you've got the podcast, you've got a book, all that kind of stuff. So tell everybody where to get in touch with you and kind of get into your world and connect further.
Sure thing. Well, I'm most active these days on the Makers and Mystics podcast. And so you can find that on every podcast platform. We're also on Instagram at Makers and Mystics. And yeah, and then of course you can keep up with the music that I do at Songs of Water. And yeah, that's pretty much where we are. Also, the Breath and the Clay is the creative community side of things, which it hasn't been very active lately, but there is some talk of 2024. So we'll see what happens there.
Nice,
Yes.
awesome. Well, guys, you can go to the links that are right here, either on YouTube or on the podcast in the description, and get all those links and connect with Stephen. But man, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It's always a joy, and just love to hear what you're doing and how you're inspiring others.
Absolutely, Matt. Well, I'm totally inspired by what you're doing as well. And like I said in the beginning, it's always a treat to get to connect with you. So thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely.